Hey everyone, Professor Snart checking back in here. Been out of action for a little while. I'm in my new office, which is kind of just full of boxes and my gym towel. Pretty sweet. There's my phone. You can call me. Okay. And YouTube has been acting really weird this week. So in addition to that, my office move and me feeling kind of under the weather, it's been I've just been sort of, discombobulated a little bit. Anyway, we are actually past midterm in our course, which is kind of hard to believe. So we have just finished up the unit on Coleridge, who is one of those characters that if we could spend an entire course doing just one author, he would be a great choice. He's just so odd. There's the whole drug part that is usually overplayed, as far as his drug use and addiction is concerned, and how his poetry grows or doesn't grow out of that. Again, I could go on at length, but I won't. First off, though, just practically speaking, the Coleridge unit, I should say, I guess I just forgot within the discussion board part to actually say to respond to somebody. So if you didn't, I get it, it wasn't assigned, but if you did, I really appreciate that, even though it wasn't, officially there in the requirements. So thanks for doing that if you did. And some people responded to a couple of other posts, which is great to see. And then the ideas that people were developing relative to Coleridge, the Ancient Mariner, and then those marginal glosses, the little notes that he puts on the side, I think were really interesting. And so many people noticed how variable they are. Some of the glosses are really helpful. Some of them are completely not helpful. Some of them go off in completely random directions. Some of them tell us what we already get in the poem. And some people ask, why add them? Why did he add them so late? And in fact, I'll give you kind of the answer to those questions, and even the answer to how I think Coleridge saw those. He really wasn't being serious, and they're not comical, but they certainly are ironic or satirical. So the initial response to the poem is that it's too impenetrable. So you have this poem with this central event that never goes explained. Why does this guy shoot the damn bird? He just does it, right? Out of nowhere. Why? Why? So the meaning of the poem, and I hate to even kind of say that, but really the question it asks is what's the motivation for certain kinds of actions we take? How do we explain what we've done? And Coleridge's answer is really embedded in the poem that doesn't provide an answer to why the mariner does this, is that sometimes we just don't know. So the initial response of readers to the poem was that, yeah, it was kind of creepy and interesting, but it left a lot to be desired as far as explanation, why did these things happen? So I think a little bit out of spite, which Coleridge is really good at, he adds these marginal notes. Turn my crappy Pandora off. Coleridge adds these notes that are almost making fun of this sort of scholarly, editorial, spark note, cliff note kind of voice, oh, this is how you explain a poem, or this is how you explain an action. And so they're not very satisfying as marginal glosses, even though at some points they really do help us to understand what's going on. So if you felt like you've been cheated a little bit, like you really actually liked the glosses and wish that writers would do more of that, that's perfectly legitimate, right? Because they are actually helpful in a lot of cases. And in fact, if you remove the poem part and just took the glosses, they're much more, they make a lot more sense, really, on a surface level. But of course, that's sort of the fun that Coleridge is poking at, that very kind of approach that wants an explanation for why things happen. So really that poem, where so many people read it, and you get to the moral, quote unquote, at the end, that the mariner gives, that too is supposed to ring, I think, a little bit hollow, it's a little too simplistic how that poem wraps up. And that, yeah, he did this bad deed, but now he's learned his lesson, and we can just be happy with that. I don't think Coleridge really wanted us to be happy with that. He wanted us to really find the moral a little bit thin, and then he adds the glosses, which themselves try to grapple with the poem but don't do a very good job of it. That's all part of the meaning of the poem. Really in a lot of ways like Kubla Khan, is not just this poem about the few lines, the few poetic lines of verse, but it's all of the machinery around it, the various notes that he added, the little story about him being in the farmhouse, falling asleep, having this kind of vision, dream, imagination sort of thing going on. All of that is the poem. And that's what's so fascinating about Coleridge, and why he would be a great author to study for a whole course, is that his works don't really function in the way that we'd like them to. They don't subscribe to specific genres. Kubla Khan is a vision in a fragment or a dream. It's like he can't even decide what to call the damn thing. So they sort of float midway between this genre, that genre, like the glosses float between here's something solid we can say, or here's just something that we're repeating from the text already, or here's something totally random about like the history of Hebraic scholarship about an angel or whatever the case might be. So Coleridge is just sort of endlessly fascinating because his poems kind of mean not something that you can summarize neatly and explain everything, but their meaning really exists in the act of us reading them, trying to figure out what's going on and how all the pieces make sense together. So he is just endlessly fascinating as an author for me, and he really shares that in common with Blake, who is my particular area of expertise. And again, for much the same reason, that it's just hard to come to solid conclusions about like meaning, quote unquote. Their works really throw that whole enterprise of reading and deriving meaning into question. Quite consciously, it's not just fluke that their works do this. I think they were very intentional about what was going on. So anyway, we move away from the Romantic period that was so much about vision, imagination, notions of how the reader engages with the text, and can we ever come to solid conclusions about that. We move into the Victorian era, which really sees the pendulum swing back towards the capacity of reason and of people to make sound judgments. And this is really also an era of fundamental social change, the whole Industrial Revolution, which truly began really before the Romantic period, but gained strength and really came to fruition in the Victorian period. And it's really during that time that the Industrial Revolution, it doesn't begin, but its impact socially is maybe most noticeable for the most number of people. So that's part of the context that we need to understand as we get into the Victorian period. So we start with someone like Matthew Arnold, who is, like T.S. Eliot, both a critic, a theorist, a prose writer, but also a pretty famous poet in his own right. So he takes on these two different roles. And in fact, the readings that we have from him really show, if you didn't know they were the same person, I think you'd be hard-pressed to guess that the guy who writes Dover Beach is also the guy who writes Culture and Anarchy, which is the prose piece that we read. But he is this quintessential Victorian figure inasmuch as his Culture and Anarchy are really what we should understand as like culture or anarchy. His response to that Victorian period is that we have two options: either anarchy, either things completely break down, or culture, which has at its root the capacity of people to reason and make right choices. In fact, he even uses the phrase right reason. So he returns us to that tradition that we'd seen through Milton and Wollstonecraft, with this emphasis on reason and good decision making. And then again, for him, because the Victorian period is so kind of urbanized and congested and condensed, and the pace of change is so fast, it's really sort of a drastic choice for Arnold that if we don't have this, the application of reason and culture or education, then the alternative is really just anarchy, people doing whatever they want because theoretically they have the right to do so, which is a very modern idea and one that's still with us. People just sort of do things declaring that it's their right to do so. We actually see examples of that in contemporary media all the time, and it's still really a question, especially I think for us in the States, because so much of the myth of America is built on individual liberty and freedom. And then Arnold's question, which is not posed in terms of the U.S., but I think is ideally suited for us right now, is, well, just because you have the right to liberty, does that give you the right to do whatever you like? Doing as one likes is what Arnold calls it. And then we get into a section on the Brownings, Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning, two very famous poets in their own right. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning especially was really a voice for social change during her day. So another one of those poets who's not just kind of off in the clouds, you know, the stereotypical sort of thing, but really engaged in trying to affect social change in her day. So she's a really interesting figure to read. Okay, so we continue to zip through things here. Be in touch with me if you run into any problems or if things aren't working. Again, I've noticed YouTube really being weird lately, so if videos aren't showing up in our course, it's not a course issue or a Blackboard issue or my or your technical issue. It's probably a YouTube issue, but hopefully that's more or less resolved. Since obviously a lot of our course contains YouTube-based video stuff. Okay, so hopefully you're enjoying the course so far and the readings that we're doing. We move so quickly it's hard to even get like a sense of being immersed in a certain literary era or time period. But again, hopefully you're getting a sense of how these things relate to each other and some of the specific authors within those various periods. So be in touch with any questions and I'll talk to everybody soon.